In the shadows of Windsor Castle, where ancient stones hold centuries of secrets, one ordinary Tuesday morning would forever change the lives of two men from completely different worlds. One wore the crown of England, carrying the weight of a nation on his shoulders. The other wore a simple uniform, invisible to most, yet destined to become the silent hero in a moment that would test the very foundations of duty, courage, and human connection. What happened in those crucial 47 seconds on that crisp autumn morning would remain buried in official silence for months. The media knew nothing. The public saw nothing. Even the royal family's closest advisors were kept in the dark about the incident that nearly changed the course of British history forever. This is the untold story of Detective Sergeant Marcus Thompson, a man whose quick thinking and unwavering bravery saved not just a life, but a legacy. It's a story about split-second decisions that echo through eternity, about the unbreakable bond formed between protector and protected, and about a king's quiet gratitude that would manifest in ways no one could have imagined. Sometimes the most extraordinary acts of heroism happen in complete silence, witnessed only by the walls that have stood for centuries, waiting to whisper their secrets to those brave enough to listen. Detective Sergeant Marcus Thompson had always believed that heroes were made in the pages of history books, not in the quiet corridors of Windsor Castle on an ordinary Tuesday morning. At 42, with 17 years of police service behind him, Marcus had seen enough of life to know that real heroism rarely announced itself with trumpets and fanfare. Instead, it crept up silently, demanding everything from a person in moments when they least expected it. The morning of October 15th began like any other in Marcus's carefully structured world. His alarm rang at 5:30 sharp, just as it had every working day for the past 3 years since he'd been assigned to the Royal Protection Unit. The modest flat in Windsor, that he shared with his wife Sarah and their twin daughters, seemed almost too ordinary for a man whose job was to safeguard one of the most recognizable figures in the world. Sarah was already in the kitchen when Marcus emerged from their bedroom, her nurse's uniform crisp and ready for another long shift at the local hospital. The twins, Emma and Grace, were still asleep, their school bags packed and waiting by the front door for their grandmother to collect them later. This was the rhythm of the Thompson family life, measured and predictable, built around the demands of two careers dedicated to serving others. Marcus kissed Sarah goodbye at the door. The same gentle kiss they'd shared nearly every morning for the past 15 years of marriage. Neither of them knew that this particular morning would be etched into their memories forever, becoming a dividing line between the life they knew and the life that would follow. The drive to Windsor Castle took Marcus through the familiar streets of the town that had become their home. He passed the same shops, the same faces walking their dogs, the same rhythm of small-town life that had first attracted him and Sarah when they'd moved here from London. The castle loomed ahead, its ancient towers catching the first rays of autumn sunlight, a reminder of the weight of history that surrounded his daily work. Inside the castle walls, Marcus joined his colleagues for the morning briefing. The Royal Protection Unit was a tight-knit group, men and women who understood that their primary job was to remain invisible while being prepared for anything. Detective Inspector Patricia Hayes, their commanding officer, ran through the day's schedule with military precision. King Charles would be receiving several private audiences, including meetings with foreign diplomats and charity representatives. The schedule appeared routine, nothing that would raise any particular concerns. Marcus had been assigned to the inner perimeter detail, responsible for the corridors and rooms immediately surrounding the King's private offices. It was a position of trust that reflected his years of exemplary service and his ability to blend seamlessly into the background while maintaining constant vigilance. He knew these corridors like the lines on his own hands, every doorway, every potential entrance or exit, every hiding place that could conceal a threat. The King's first appointment of the day was scheduled for 9:30 with Ambassador Rodriguez from Spain, a routine diplomatic courtesy that was expected to last no more than 30 minutes. Marcus positioned himself in the corridor outside the King's study, close enough to respond immediately to any situation, but far enough away to provide the privacy that such meetings required. As he stood there, Marcus found his mind wandering to the weekend plans he'd made with his family. Emma and Grace had been asking to visit the London Eye, and he'd promised to take them on Saturday if the weather held. Sarah had been working extra shifts at the hospital, and he knew she needed the break as much as the girls needed the adventure. These small family moments had become precious to Marcus, reminders of the normal life that existed beyond the walls of the castle. The ambassadors' meeting concluded exactly on schedule, and Marcus watched as the distinguished gentleman was escorted out by one of the junior protection officers. The King's next appointment wasn't until 10:45, which meant a brief respite in what promised to be a busy day. Marcus used this quiet time to walk his assigned patrol route, checking sightlines and ensuring that all security protocols remained in place. It was during this routine patrol that Marcus first noticed something unusual. The morning cleaning staff had finished their work in this section of the castle, but he noticed that one of the service doors leading to the maintenance corridors had been left slightly ajar. Protocol dictated that all service areas should be secured when not in active use, and this small deviation from the normal routine triggered the instincts that 17 years of police work had honed to a razor's edge. Marcus approached the door carefully, his training taking over as he assessed the situation. The corridor beyond was dimly lit and appeared empty, but something felt wrong. It was nothing he could put his finger on immediately, just the subtle sense that the environment had been disturbed in some way. He spoke quietly into his radio, informing the control room of his intention to investigate the unsecured door. The maintenance corridor was part of a network of service passages that ran throughout the castle, designed to allow staff to move about their duties without disturbing the royal family or their guests. These corridors were thoroughly secured and monitored, but their very existence meant that they required constant vigilance from the protection teams. Marcus moved through the corridor methodically, checking each junction and doorway as he went. It was then that he heard it, a sound so faint that anyone else might have dismissed it as the natural settling of an ancient building. But Marcus had spent years learning to distinguish between the normal sounds of the castle and anything that didn't belong. This was definitely something that didn't belong. The sound was rhythmic and deliberate, like someone trying very hard to move silently but not quite succeeding. Marcus drew his weapon, though he kept it low, and ready rather than raised. His training emphasized that the protection of the royal family required both decisive action and absolute discretion. False alarms were common in high-security environments, and the last thing anyone wanted was to create a panic over what might turn out to be a maintenance worker who had forgotten to follow proper protocols. Following the sound deeper into the maze of service corridors, Marcus began to piece together what was happening. Someone was definitely in the corridors who shouldn't be there, someone who was trying to remain undetected. The questions racing through his mind were simple but critical. Who was it? How had they gained access? And most importantly, what were their intentions? The corridors led in several directions, some toward the public areas of the castle, others toward the private residential sections where the royal family lived and worked. Marcus realized that he was potentially dealing with someone who had gained unauthorized access to one of the most secure buildings in the United Kingdom. Every instinct he possessed told him that this was not a simple security breach, but something far more serious. As he moved deeper into the corridor system, Marcus maintained radio contact with the control room, providing updates on his location and status. The other members of his team were being discreetly repositioned to provide backup if needed, but the response had to be measured and professional. The king's schedule would continue as normal unless and until there was clear evidence of an immediate threat. The sound was getting closer now, and Marcus could tell that whoever was in the corridors was moving with a specific purpose. They weren't lost or confused. They knew exactly where they were going. This realization sent a chill down Marcus's spine as he considered the implications. If someone had gained this level of access to the castle's service areas, they had either been planning this intrusion for a considerable time, or they had inside knowledge of the building's layout and security procedures. Marcus reached a junction in the corridors where he would have to make a crucial decision. One path led toward the public areas of the castle, where tourists and staff moved about their daily business. The other path led directly toward the section of the building where King Charles was scheduled to be working that morning. The choice of which direction to take could mean the difference between intercepting a petty criminal and preventing a catastrophic security incident.
The faint sounds he'd been following seemed to be coming from the direction of the royal offices.
Marcus felt his heart rate increase as the full weight of the situation began to settle on his shoulders. Everything in his training had prepared him for this moment, but no amount of preparation could fully account for the reality of potentially facing a genuine threat to the person he'd sworn to protect. Moving with the silent precision that years of tactical training had ingrained in him, Marcus advanced toward what he now believed was a direct threat to King Charles. The corridor ahead was darker than the others, lit only by emergency lighting that cast long shadows along the walls. In those shadows, Marcus could see the outline of a figure moving with careful deliberation toward what could only be one destination, the king's private study. The figure ahead of Marcus moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. In the dim emergency lighting of the service corridor, Marcus could see that the intruder was dressed in dark clothing and appeared to be carrying something in their right hand. The object was too small to be a weapon in the traditional sense, but Marcus's experience told him that the most dangerous threats often came in the smallest packages. As he closed the distance between himself and the unknown figure, Marcus found himself thinking about the training scenarios he'd run countless times during his years with the Royal Protection Unit. Every possible threat had been analyzed, every response carefully planned and rehearsed. But no training scenario could fully prepare someone for the weight of responsibility that came with knowing that the next few moments could determine whether a king lived or died. The intruder had reached a section of the corridor that Marcus knew led directly to a service entrance near the king's study. This entrance was supposed to be secured at all times, monitored by both electronic surveillance and physical patrols. The fact that someone had gotten this far meant that multiple security layers had been compromised, either through exceptional planning or inside assistance. Marcus spoke into his radio in the quietest whisper possible, updating the control room on his position and the imminent threat he was tracking. The response was immediate and professional. Additional units were being moved into position, but they had to be careful not to create a situation that might panic the intruder into taking desperate action. The king was being discreetly relocated to a more secure area of the castle, though this had to be done without disrupting his schedule or alerting anyone who might be watching. The corridor ahead curved slightly to the right, and as Marcus followed it, he realized that he was now only yards away from the person who had somehow penetrated what was supposed to be one of the most secure buildings in the world. His training told him to wait for backup, to maintain surveillance until other units could coordinate a response that would minimize risk to all parties involved. But his instincts told him something different. The intruder had stopped moving. They were crouched near what Marcus knew was the service entrance to the area immediately outside the king's study. In the faint light, he could see that they were working on something, their hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times before. Whatever they were doing, they were running out of time to complete it before backup arrived and the situation escalated beyond anyone's control. Marcus made a decision that would haunt and define him for the rest of his life. Instead of waiting for backup, instead of following the protocols that demanded caution and coordination, he chose to act on the knowledge that sometimes 47 seconds can change the course of history. He moved forward, closing the final distance between himself and the figure that represented everything his career had prepared him to face. The confrontation, when it came, was nothing like the dramatic scenes Marcus had imagined during his training. There was no shouting, no dramatic revelations, no moment of recognition or understanding. Instead, there was simply a man crouched in a dimly lit corridor, working frantically on what appeared to be a small electronic device, who looked up to see Detective Sergeant Marcus Thompson pointing a weapon at him with steady, professional hands. The man was younger than Marcus had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of ordinary face that would disappear in any crowd. His clothes were dark, but not tactical, more like the outfit someone might wear for a job interview or a quiet dinner. The only thing that marked him as dangerous was the intense focus in his eyes and the small device he'd been working on, which Marcus could now see was some kind of timer mechanism. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two men looked at each other across the narrow corridor. Marcus could see the calculations running behind the intruder's eyes, the assessment of options and possibilities that every desperate person makes when their carefully laid plans suddenly fall apart. He could also see the moment when the man realized that his mission, whatever it was, had failed. The intruder's hands moved slowly away from the device, and Marcus could see that it was more complex than he had initially thought. Wires, a small digital display, and what appeared to be enough plastic explosive to bring down a significant portion of the corridor structure. The realization of what he was looking at hit Marcus like a physical blow. This wasn't just a security breach or an attempt at theft. This was someone who had come to Windsor Castle with the intention of committing an act that would have consequences far beyond anything the protection unit had ever been called upon to prevent. The man spoke for the first time, his voice calm and educated, with traces of an accent that Marcus couldn't immediately place. He said simply, "You're too late." And then his hand moved toward what Marcus could see was a manual trigger device attached to the explosive. What happened next would be analyzed and reanalyzed by security experts, psychologists, and tactical specialists for years to come. Marcus Thompson, a man who had spent his career preparing for this exact moment, made a choice that combined 17 years of training with pure human instinct. He didn't hesitate, didn't negotiate, didn't try to talk the man down or wait for backup to arrive. He acted with the kind of decisive certainty that separates those who protect from those who are protected. The single shot echoed through the service corridor with a sound that seemed to go on forever. In the aftermath, as Marcus moved quickly to secure the explosive device and call for the bomb disposal team, he found himself thinking, not about the life he had just taken, but about the life he had just saved. Somewhere in the floors above, King Charles was going about his morning schedule, unaware that the course of British history had just been altered by 47 seconds of action in a corridor that most people would never see. The bomb disposal team arrived within minutes. Their expertise immediately focused on the device that the intruder had been preparing to detonate. The mechanism was sophisticated, designed to cause maximum structural damage to the section of the castle that housed the king's private offices. If it had been triggered, the explosion would have brought down centuries-old stone walls and likely killed anyone in the immediate area. As the specialists worked to safe the device, Marcus found himself being led away for the immediate debriefing that followed any incident involving the use of deadly force. The questions came in rapid succession, each one designed to establish the timeline of events and the justification for his actions. But even as he answered them with the professional precision his training demanded, Marcus was thinking about something else entirely. He was thinking about his daughters, Emma and Grace, and how he would explain to them someday why their father had chosen a career that sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice. He was thinking about Sarah, and whether she would understand that the man she'd married had done what needed to be done to protect someone they'd never meet, but whose safety was somehow connected to everything they believed about duty and service. Most of all, he was thinking about King Charles, who would probably never know exactly what had happened in the service corridor that morning. The incident would be classified, the details buried in official reports that would remain sealed for decades. The king would continue his schedule, meet with his remaining appointments, and go about the business of being a monarch, unaware that his life had been saved by a police officer whose name he would never know. But Marcus would know. For the rest of his life, he would carry the knowledge that he had been tested in the most fundamental way possible and had not been found wanting. He had faced the moment that every protection officer dreams about and fears in equal measure, and he had acted with the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself, but simply does what needs to be done. The investigation that followed would reveal that the intruder had been planning his attack for months, studying the castle's layout, identifying security weaknesses, and preparing for a mission that was intended to send a message to the world about the vulnerability of even the most protected individuals. His background revealed connections to extremist groups, a history of radical beliefs, and access to the kind of technical knowledge that had allowed him to construct a sophisticated explosive device. What the investigation would never fully explain was how Marcus Thompson had known, in those crucial moments, exactly what needed to be done. The official reports would cite his training, his experience, and his adherence to established protocols, but those who knew Marcus understood that something deeper had been at work that morning, something that couldn't be taught in any training program or written into any manual. As the day wore on and the immediate aftermath of the incident was managed with the discretion that such situations demanded, Marcus began to understand that his life had been fundamentally changed. He had crossed a line that most people never have to face, made a choice that would define him for the rest of his career and beyond. The weight of that realization settled on his shoulders as he completed the endless paperwork and debriefings that followed any use of deadly force. The weeks following the incident passed in a blur of investigations, interviews, and psychological evaluations that were standard procedure after any officer-involved shooting. Marcus found himself spending more time in conference rooms and offices than in the corridors of Windsor Castle, answering the same questions over and over again from different people who needed to understand exactly what had happened in those 47 seconds that had changed everything. Detective Inspector Patricia Hayes conducted most of the internal interviews herself, her approach professional but tinged with the kind of concern that comes from years of leading officers who face impossible choices in impossible situations. She had seen good officers destroyed by the weight of taking a life, even when that action was absolutely justified and necessary. Her job was to ensure that Marcus Thompson didn't become another casualty of doing what needed to be done. During one particularly long session in her office, Hayes asked Marcus the question that had been underlying all the others. "Do you have any regrets about how you handled the situation?" she asked, her eyes studying his face for signs of the doubt or trauma that often followed such incidents. Marcus thought carefully before answering, knowing that his response would become part of his permanent record and could affect his future with the Royal Protection Unit. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally, "but I don't regret the choice I made. If I had to do it again, knowing everything I know now, I would make the same decision." The psychological evaluation was conducted by Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a specialist in trauma counseling who had worked with law enforcement officers for more than 20 years. She had a reputation for being able to identify officers who were struggling to cope with the aftermath of violent encounters, and her recommendation carried significant weight in determining whether Marcus would be cleared to return to active duty. Dr. Hartwell's approach was different from the administrative interviews. She was interested not just in what Marcus had done, but in how he was processing what had happened and what it meant for his ability to continue in his role. During their sessions, she helped him work through the complex emotions that came with taking a life, even when that action was clearly justified and had prevented a much greater tragedy. The hardest part for Marcus was not the official scrutiny or the professional evaluations. It was going home each evening to Sarah and the girls, carrying the weight of what had happened while trying to maintain the normalcy of family life. The incident was classified at the highest levels, which meant he couldn't discuss it with anyone outside of the official investigation. Sarah knew something significant had occurred, but the details were locked away behind security protocols that he couldn't breach even with his wife. Sarah had always understood that Marcus's work carried risks and responsibilities that she might never fully understand. As a nurse, she had her own experience with life and death decisions, though hers were made in hospital rooms rather than castle corridors. She could see the change in her husband, the weight he was carrying, and she did what she had always done throughout their marriage. She provided the steady, loving support that allowed him to do his job while remaining the father and husband their family needed. Emma and Grace noticed the change too, in the way that children always seem to sense when something important has shifted in their world. Marcus found himself holding them a little tighter during their bedtime stories, appreciating the simple joy of their laughter in a way that felt more precious than before. The incident had given him a renewed perspective on what truly mattered, even as it had required him to take an action that would stay with him forever. 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus was cleared to return to active duty. The investigation had concluded that his actions were not only justified, but had prevented what could have been a catastrophic terrorist attack. The bomb disposal experts had determined that the device was sophisticated enough to have caused significant structural damage to the castle and could have killed anyone in the vicinity of the king's study. Returning to the corridors of Windsor Castle felt strange at first. Marcus found himself retracing his steps from that morning, walking the same route he had followed when he first noticed the unsecured service door. The maintenance corridor where the confrontation had taken place had been thoroughly cleaned and repaired, with additional security measures installed to prevent any similar breach in the future. His colleagues in the Royal Protection Unit treated him with a mixture of professional respect and personal concern. Everyone understood that Marcus had done exactly what his training and instincts had demanded, but they also knew that carrying such an experience was not something that any officer should have to bear alone. The unit functioned as a family, and families take care of their own. It was during his second week back on duty that Marcus received a message that would puzzle him for months to come. Detective Inspector Hayes called him into her office and handed him an envelope marked only with his name, written in elegant handwriting that suggested education and careful attention to detail. Inside the envelope was a brief note on heavy paper that bore no official letterhead or identifying marks. The message was simple. Your service to the Crown has been noted with the deepest gratitude. Your discretion in this matter is appreciated and will be remembered. The note was unsigned, but Marcus had spent enough time in official circles to recognize the kind of communication that came from the highest levels of government. Someone, somewhere, knew exactly what had happened in the service corridor and wanted him to understand that his actions had not gone unnoticed. The knowledge that his service was appreciated by people he would never meet was both gratifying and humbling. As autumn gave way to winter, Marcus settled back into the routines of his job with a deeper understanding of what his work really meant. The daily briefings, the patrol routes, the constant vigilance that protection work required, all took on a different significance. He had been tested in the most fundamental way possible and had proven to himself and others that he was capable of making the hard choices that his position sometimes demanded. The incident had also strengthened his marriage in ways he hadn't expected. Sarah, despite not knowing the details of what had happened, seemed to understand that her husband had faced something significant and had emerged from it with his integrity intact. The trust between them, already strong after 15 years of marriage, had been deepened by the knowledge that they could face uncertainty together without needing to share every detail of their professional lives. Emma and Grace continued to be the center of Marcus's world, their innocent questions about his work serving as reminders of the normal life that existed beyond the walls of Windsor Castle. When Grace asked him one evening why he looked sad sometimes, Marcus was able to tell her honestly that his job sometimes required him to make difficult decisions, but that he was proud to do work that helped keep people safe. The Christmas season brought with it a renewed appreciation for the traditions and ceremonies that were part of royal life. Marcus found himself watching King Charles during the various holiday events with a different perspective, knowing that the monarch was continuing his duties completely unaware of how close he had come to a very different kind of Christmas. The knowledge was both profound and strangely comforting, suggesting that the best protection was often invisible and unrecognized. On Christmas Eve, as Marcus completed his final patrol of the evening shift, he received another surprise. Detective Inspector Hayes approached him near the end of his tour with another envelope, this one bearing the official seal of Buckingham Palace. Inside was an invitation to a small reception being held in the new year for members of the various security services who had provided exceptional service during the previous year. The invitation was formal and official, the kind of recognition that came occasionally to members of the protection services but was always appreciated. What made this invitation different was a small handwritten addition at the bottom. Your presence would be particularly welcome. The handwriting was the same elegant script that had been on the unsigned note from weeks earlier. Marcus understood that this invitation was more than just a routine recognition. Someone wanted to meet him, to acknowledge his service in person, even if the details of that service could never be publicly discussed. The prospect of such a meeting filled him with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that he hadn't felt since his first day with the Royal Protection Unit. As he drove home that Christmas Eve, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed since that October morning, when he had followed the sound of an intruder through the service corridors of Windsor Castle. He had always known that his job carried the potential for situations that would test his training and his character, but he had never imagined that when that test came, it would teach him as much about himself as it did about his capabilities as a protection officer. The quiet streets of Windsor looked peaceful in the Christmas Eve snow, the same streets he had driven countless times on his way to and from the castle. But now they carried a different meaning, connecting his family life to his professional calling in a way that felt more significant than before. He was no longer just a police officer who happened to work at Windsor Castle. He was someone who had been tested and had not been found wanting. Someone whose actions had mattered in ways that would remain forever hidden from public view. At home, Sarah and the girls were waiting with the Christmas Eve traditions that had become the foundation of their family life. As Marcus joined them around the Christmas tree, helping Emma and Grace arrange the presents they had wrapped for each other, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the normal life that his work made possible. The incident in October had reminded him that the ordinary moments were often the most precious, and that protecting others meant protecting the simple joys that made life worth living. The reception at Buckingham Palace was scheduled for a Thursday evening in late January, and as the date approached, Marcus found himself growing increasingly curious about what the event would entail. The invitation had provided few details beyond the date, time, and dress code, leaving him to wonder who else would be in attendance, and what kind of recognition, if any, he might receive. Sarah helped him prepare for the evening, adjusting his dress uniform and making sure every detail was perfect. She had always taken pride in his appearance during official events, understanding that representing the Royal Protection Unit meant representing the highest standards of the service. As she straightened his tie one final time, she asked the question that had been underlying their conversations about the invitation. "Will I finally learn what happened that made you so different after October?" she asked, her hand still adjusting his collar, but her eyes studying his face with the intensity that came from 15 years of marriage. Marcus considered the question carefully. The classification of the incident meant that he still couldn't discuss the details, but he could see that Sarah deserved some acknowledgement of what she had observed and supported during the difficult weeks that had followed. "I can't tell you exactly what happened," he said finally, "but I can tell you that I did my job, and that sometimes doing your job means making choices that change you." Sarah nodded, accepting the limitation while still providing the support that had carried them through the uncertainty of the past months. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "Whatever happened, I know you did the right thing." The evening of the reception, Marcus arrived at Buckingham Palace through the same security procedures he had navigated countless times during his career, but tonight felt different. ISIS. He was not here as a working protection officer, but as a guest, invited to celebrate achievements that would never be publicly acknowledged, but were no less significant for their secrecy. The reception was held in one of the smaller staterooms, intimate by palace standards, but still impressive enough to remind everyone present of the weight of history and tradition that surrounded their work. About 30 people were in attendance, a mix of police officers, intelligence operatives, and military personnel who had provided exceptional service during the previous year. Marcus recognized some of his colleagues from the Royal Protection Unit, but most of the other guests were strangers, people whose work in the shadows of national security had brought them to the attention of those who managed such recognition. The atmosphere was professional but warm, with the kind of camaraderie that develops among people who understand the unique pressures of protecting others. The reception had been underway for about an hour when Marcus noticed a subtle shift in the room's energy. Conversations continued, but there was an awareness that someone significant had entered. He turned to see King Charles moving quietly through the gathering, speaking individually with many of the guests, taking time to acknowledge their service in person. Marcus watched as the king approached other guests, noting the genuine interest he showed in their work and the questions he asked about their experiences. This was clearly not a perfunctory appearance, but a meaningful attempt to connect with the people who worked behind the scenes to ensure his safety and the security of the realm. When King Charles finally approached Marcus, the moment felt both surreal and entirely natural. Here was the man whose life Marcus had saved, completely unaware of the debt that existed between them, engaging in the kind of conversation that might happen at any professional gathering. "Detective Sergeant Thompson," the king said, extending his hand with a warmth that surprised Marcus. "I understand you've had quite a significant year." The greeting suggested that King Charles knew more about the October incident than Marcus had expected, though the exact extent of his knowledge remained unclear. Marcus responded with the professional courtesy his training had taught him, but he could see something in the king's eyes that went beyond routine recognition. They spoke for several minutes about Marcus's career, his family, and his experience with the Royal Protection Unit. The king demonstrated the kind of personal interest that suggested this conversation was more than just polite acknowledgement. He asked about Emma and Grace, somehow knowing that Marcus had twin daughters, and inquired about Sarah's work as a nurse with the knowledge that came from genuine research rather than casual briefing. As their conversation continued, Marcus began to understand that this meeting was the king's way of acknowledging what had happened in October, without ever directly referencing the classified details. The gratitude was communicated through attention and interest, through the kind of personal recognition that meant more than any formal award or public ceremony. Near the end of their conversation, King Charles made a comment that would stay with Marcus for the rest of his life. "You know," the king said quietly, "there are moments in all of our lives when we're called upon to serve something larger than ourselves. The remarkable thing is that most of the time we rise to meet that calling, often in ways we never expected." The words were general enough to apply to anyone in the room, but Marcus understood that they were meant specifically for him. This was as close as the king could come to acknowledging what had happened in the service corridor without breaching the security protocols that protected both of them. As King Charles moved on to speak with other guests, Marcus found himself processing the profound nature of what had just occurred. He had been personally thanked by the man whose life he had saved, even though that thanks could never be made explicit or public. The knowledge that his actions were understood and appreciated at the highest levels provided a sense of closure that no amount of official recognition could have achieved. The remainder of the reception passed in a blur of conversations and networking, but Marcus's mind kept returning to his exchange with King Charles. He had entered the evening curious about what kind of recognition he might receive, and he was leaving with something far more valuable: the knowledge that his service had been personally acknowledged by the person who mattered most. The drive home gave Marcus time to reflect on how much his perspective had changed since October. The incident had tested him in ways he had never anticipated, forcing him to confront the reality of what his job sometimes demanded. But tonight had shown him that the weight of that experience was balanced by the knowledge that his actions had mattered, had made a difference in ways that would remain forever hidden, but were no less significant. At home, Sarah was waiting with the patience and interest that had characterized her support throughout his career. She could see that the evening had been meaningful, even if she couldn't know the specific details of what had transpired. "How was it?" she asked as Marcus hung up his dress uniform and settled into the comfortable routine of their evening together. "It was exactly what it needed to be," Marcus replied, finding that this simple statement captured something essential about the evening, without violating the discretion that his position required. Over the following weeks, Marcus noticed subtle changes in his work environment that suggested the October incident continued to have consequences he was only beginning to understand. His assignments began to include more high-profile events and visits, responsibilities that indicated increased trust in his judgment and capabilities. The other members of his unit treated him with a respect that went beyond his rank or years of service. Detective Inspector Hayes also seemed to be watching his progress with particular interest, including him in planning sessions and strategic discussions that had previously been above his level. When Marcus asked her about these new responsibilities, she smiled with the kind of knowing expression that suggested she understood more about his career trajectory than she was willing to discuss. "Excellence has a way of being recognized," she said simply. "Sometimes it takes a while for the full implications to become clear, but good work eventually leads to good opportunities." The February morning when Marcus received notification of his promotion to detective inspector came as a surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. The promotion was officially based on his years of exemplary service, his leadership potential, and his demonstrated ability to handle complex situations with discretion and professionalism. The October incident was not mentioned in the official paperwork, but Marcus understood that it had played a role in the decision. The promotion meant new responsibilities, including oversight of other protection officers and involvement in the strategic planning that kept the royal family safe. It also meant that Marcus would be moving into the kind of leadership role that could shape the next generation of officers, who might one day face the same impossible choices he had confronted in a dimly lit service corridor. As he prepared to take on his new position, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The incident in October had been a test that he had passed, but it had also been a revelation about what service really meant. It wasn't just about following protocols or maintaining vigilance, though those things were important. It was about being prepared to make the choices that others couldn't make, to carry the weight of decisions that would remain forever hidden, and to find meaning in work that would never be fully understood or appreciated by the people it protected. The knowledge that King Charles was aware of and grateful for his service, even if that gratitude could only be expressed indirectly, provided a foundation of meaning that would sustain Marcus throughout the rest of his career. He had been tested and had not been found wanting, had served with distinction in a moment that demanded everything he had to give, and had emerged from the experience with his integrity and sense of purpose intact. 2 years later, Detective Inspector Marcus Thompson stood in his new office overlooking the same corridors where his life had changed forever. The promotion had brought with it not just increased responsibility, but a deeper understanding of the complex web of security, intelligence, and protection that surrounded the royal family every day. From this position, he could see how his actions in October had been part of a much larger picture, one that he was now helping to shape and direct. The office walls were decorated with commendations and photographs that told the story of his career, but the most meaningful item was something that most visitors would never notice. Tucked discreetly among the official paperwork on his desk was a small, unsigned card that had arrived on the second anniversary of the October incident. The card contained only a few words. Gratitude, like courage, is best expressed through action rather than words. Marcus had recognized the handwriting immediately as the same elegant script that had appeared on the previous unsigned notes. Someone, somewhere, was keeping track of anniversaries and ensuring that his service continued to be remembered, even if it could never be publicly acknowledged. The knowledge that his actions remained in someone's thoughts after 2 years provided a continuity of meaning that sustained him through the daily challenges of his new position. His responsibilities now included training new officers, many of whom reminded him of himself when he had first joined the Royal Protection Unit. Full of dedication and professional pride, they approached their work with the kind of earnest commitment that Marcus remembered from his early days. What they couldn't yet understand was how quickly circumstances could test everything they thought they knew about themselves and their capabilities. During training sessions, Marcus found himself emphasizing decision-making under pressure, the importance of trusting instincts that had been sharpened by experience, and the reality that protection work sometimes demanded choices that would stay with an officer for the rest of their career. He couldn't share the specific details of his own experience, but he could help prepare others for the moment when training met reality in ways that no classroom exercise could fully simulate. One of the new officers, Detective Constable James Palmer, reminded Marcus particularly of his younger self. Palmer had the same combination of analytical thinking and protective instinct that Marcus recognized as essential for the work they did. During one training exercise, Palmer asked the question that Marcus had been expecting someone to raise. "Inspector Thompson," Palmer said during a debriefing session, "how do you know when to trust your instincts over established protocols? What do you do when the situation doesn't match anything you've trained for?" The question hung in the air as Marcus considered how to answer honestly without revealing classified information. "You train so extensively that your instincts become informed by your knowledge," he said finally. "When the moment comes, if it comes, you'll find that everything you've learned has prepared you to make the right choice, even if you can't explain exactly how you know what that choice is." The answer seemed to satisfy Palmer, but Marcus could see the follow-up questions in the younger officer's eyes. These were the same questions Marcus had carried early in his career, the wondering about how he would perform when everything was on the line. The October incident had answered those questions for Marcus in the most definitive way possible, but each officer had to find their own answers in their own way. As spring arrived, Marcus received news that would bring his story full circle in a way he never could have anticipated. Detective Inspector Hayes called him into her office with the kind of serious expression that immediately commanded attention. She had been promoted herself and was preparing to move on to a position with the Metropolitan Police, but before she left, she had something important to discuss. "Marcus," she said, settling into a chair with the weight of someone who was about to share significant information, "I've been authorized to brief you on something that I think you'll find interesting." It concerns the October incident and some developments that have occurred since then. The investigation into the October terrorist plot, Hayes explained, had continued long after the immediate threat had been neutralized. Intelligence services had used information gathered from the scene to uncover a larger network of individuals who had been planning similar attacks on high-profile targets. The disruption of this network had prevented what could have been a coordinated campaign of violence that would have shaken the foundations of British society. The bomber Marcus had confronted in the service corridor had been part of a cell that had been planning attacks on multiple government and royal facilities. His attempt on King Charles's life had been intended as the opening move in a series of strikes designed to create maximum chaos and fear. The fact that Marcus had stopped the first attack had not only saved the king's life, but had disrupted the entire campaign before it could begin. The intelligence gathered from that scene has led to the arrest of 17 individuals across 3 countries, Hayes continued. We've prevented at least 4 additional attacks, and we've significantly damaged the operational capability of the network that was behind the planning. The information was staggering in its implications. Marcus had known that his actions in October had been significant, but he was only now beginning to understand the true scope of what had been prevented. The 47 seconds in the service corridor had not just saved one life, but had potentially saved dozens of lives and prevented a campaign of terror that could have changed the course of history. Hayes leaned forward, her expression reflecting the seriousness of what she was about to say. There's one more thing you need to know. King Charles has been fully briefed on all of these developments. He knows exactly what you prevented and how your actions led to the disruption of this network. He's also aware that this information has been classified at the highest levels and may never be made public. The knowledge that King Charles understood the full scope of what had happened brought Marcus a sense of completion that he hadn't realized he was seeking. The personal acknowledgement at the Buckingham Palace reception had been meaningful, but knowing that the king understood the broader implications made the burden of carrying the secret somehow more bearable. As summer approached, Marcus found himself reflecting on how profoundly his life had been shaped by those 47 seconds in October. The incident had tested him, changed him, and ultimately led him to a deeper understanding of what service really meant. It had also connected him to something larger than himself, to the protection of principles and people that gave meaning to the daily work of law enforcement. Sarah had noticed the change in him over the past 2 years, the way he approached both his work and his family life with a deeper appreciation for the significance of ordinary moments. She still didn't know the details of what had happened, but she could see that her husband had been tested and had emerged stronger and more purposeful. Emma and Grace, now older and more aware of their father's work, had begun asking more sophisticated questions about what it meant to be a police officer. Marcus found himself able to talk with them about service, duty, and the importance of being prepared to help others when help was needed. The conversations were general enough to be appropriate for children their age, but they carried the weight of experience that came from having lived through the reality of making hard choices. On the 3rd anniversary of the October incident, Marcus received the most significant recognition of his career. The notification came in an official envelope bearing the seal of the Cabinet Office, and inside was a letter informing him that he had been awarded the George Medal for gallantry in preventing a terrorist attack. The award citation was carefully worded to acknowledge his bravery while maintaining the classification of the specific details. The George Medal was one of the highest awards for civilian gallantry, and receiving it marked Marcus as someone who had demonstrated exceptional courage in the face of extreme danger. What made this recognition even more meaningful was a handwritten note attached to the official documentation, written in the same elegant script he had come to recognize over the years. The note read simply, "Some acts of courage echo through time in ways their authors never imagine. Your service continues to protect more than you know." The medal ceremony was held privately, with only Sarah, Emma, Grace, and a few senior officials in attendance. King Charles himself presented the award, and as he pinned the medal to Marcus's chest, he spoke words that would remain with Marcus for the rest of his life. "Detective Inspector Thompson," the king said, his voice carrying the weight of personal knowledge and gratitude, "this medal represents not just a moment of courage, but a lifetime of service that has made a difference in ways that may never be fully understood or appreciated. Please know that your service is valued more than words can express." The ceremony was followed by a private reception, where Marcus was finally able to introduce Sarah to the king she had heard about but never met. The conversation was warm and genuine, with King Charles expressing his appreciation for the support that police families provided to officers who carried difficult responsibilities. As they drove home from the ceremony, Sarah finally asked the question she had been holding back for 3 years. "Can you tell me now what happened that October morning?" Marcus considered the question carefully, weighing his ongoing obligations against his wife's right to understand what her husband had experienced. "I can tell you that I was called upon to make a choice that prevented something terrible from happening," he said finally. "I can tell you that the choice was difficult but necessary, and that I would make it again if I had to." Sarah nodded, understanding that this was as much as he could share, while still respecting the requirements of his position. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, and Marcus knew that her pride was based not on the medal or the recognition, but on her knowledge of the man he had become through the experience. 10 years later, as Detective Inspector Marcus Thompson prepared for retirement after a distinguished career in law enforcement, he received one final communication in the familiar, elegant handwriting. This time, it came in the form of a letter that was delivered personally by a courier who waited while Marcus read it and then departed without explanation. The letter was longer than the previous notes, and for the first time, it bore an official signature that Marcus recognized as belonging to King Charles himself. The king wrote about the impact that Marcus's actions had continued to have over the years, about the lives that had been saved through the disruption of the terrorist network, and about the example his service had provided to other officers who faced similar challenges. The letter concluded with words that brought Marcus's career full circle. "Heroes are made not in the recognition they receive, but in the choices they make when no one is watching, and history hangs in the balance. Your choice in those 47 seconds changed more than you will ever know, and the gratitude of a nation, though never publicly expressed, remains eternally in your debt." As Marcus folded the letter and placed it with the other mementos of his career, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The incident in October had been a test that had defined not just his career, but his understanding of what it meant to serve others. The recognition had come slowly and quietly, often in ways that could never be shared or celebrated publicly, but it had been recognition nonetheless. The young officers he had trained over the years would carry forward the lessons he had learned through experience, preparing them for their own moments of testing when they came. The protection of those who served in public life would continue, maintained by men and women who understood that their greatest achievements might never be acknowledged, but were no less significant for their secrecy. Marcus Thompson retired with the knowledge that he had served with distinction in a moment that had demanded everything he had to give, and that his service had mattered in ways that would echo through time, long after the details were forgotten. The 47 seconds that had changed his life had also changed the lives of countless others who would never know his name but had been protected by his courage. In the end, perhaps that was the truest measure of heroism, not the recognition that came after, but the willingness to act when action was needed, regardless of whether that action would ever be acknowledged or understood. Marcus had been tested and had not been found wanting, and that knowledge would sustain him for the rest of his days.